If you found your way here, you already know. The truth lives in the shadows. Welcome to Underbelly Bloodline, where history bleeds and the past never stays buried. Subscribe if you dare, and step deeper into the dark. The road was narrow, barely more than a ribbon of cracked asphalt curling through the dense, fog-heavy woods of northern Georgia. Moonlight struggled through the thick canopy of the Blue Ridge foothills, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to slither along the edges of the forest. It was here, on a back road locals whispered about but rarely traveled, that deputies first saw him, a boy, or perhaps a man, barefoot, trembling, and covered in a thin layer of dirt and frost. His eyes were wide, haunted, as though they held centuries of secrets, secrets too heavy for one lifetime. His name, he whispered, was Harlow Cantrell, but that, like everything else he would say, seemed as fragile as the brittle autumn leaves underfoot. I escaped the covenant, he told them, voice quivering, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear and confusion. Yet moments later, his gaze hardened, and he corrected himself. No, I wasn't escaping. I was sent to deliver it. Every word he spoke contradicted the last. Each fragment of memory bent reality just enough to make the truth slippery, ungraspable. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to trust him, unsure if anyone could trust the story he carried. And Harlow himself seemed unsure, as though the years spent in Pinetop Hollow had eroded the line between survivor and inheritor, between memory and hallucination, between guilt and destiny. Around him the forest whispered, the wind through the pines, the distant cry of an owl, as if it remembered the Cantrell Pinetop bloodline in a language older than law or ledger. Harlow shivered, wrapping himself around him, his breath fogging in the cold night. They watched, and now it's me. Even in his brokenness, even in the tremor of his bare feet against the gravel, there was a strange magnetic pull to his presence, a weight that spoke of things long buried, of a lineage hidden and forbidden, of a history stitched together in secrecy and horror. He was the last thread of something that had survived a century of shadow and silence. And as the deputies guided him toward the warmth of their cruiser, the woods behind him seemed to sigh, as though aware that the story, the truth, was only just beginning. The year was 1904. At least, that is what the yellowed pages of crumbling ledgers suggested. Harlow Cantrell whispered the date like a prayer, like a curse, his voice tremulous in the chill of the abandoned deputy's office. It wiped us from the Lord's book, he said, eyes flickering like candlelight in a drafty room. All of us, the pine tops, gone. Yet when pressed, the memory splintered almost instantly. No, wait, he corrected, shaking his head, pale fingers brushing the cracked ledger. It wasn't gone. It was fire, or gunshots, or maybe God just closed his hand. His gaze darted toward the walls as though the spirits of the vanished were leaning close, waiting for his answer. Each recounting contradicted the last, leaving a hollow echo where certainty should have been. County records, if they existed at all, had long since decayed. Where there should have been births, deaths, and marriages, there were only gaps, voids where names had been erased, as if someone had taken an eraser to history itself. Harlow traced the faint ink stains, whispering, "They tried to bury us. Even the books didn't remember." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of smoke, or maybe it was just the imagination of a boy who had lived too long among rotten wood and old stone. Stories of a church disappearing in the hills were told in hushed tones by locals who still feared the hollow. "They burned it down," Harlow murmured, then paused, eyes wide and distant. "No, they didn't. It's still there, still waiting." He shook as though the memory were not his own, but some ancestral echo passed down through generations. I saw them, the shadows of those who never left. They scream, but silently, and they marked a hollow." His words blurred, slipping between fragments of truth and hallucination. The massacre, the vanished family, the erased records, all tangled into one impossible shifting image. And in that uncertainty, in that fragile, broken recollection, the story of the Cantrell Pinetop line took root in the listener's mind. A family erased, yet never gone. A massacre remembered only in fragments, whispered memories, and the fractured voice of a survivor who may or may not remember the full horror. Harlow's eyes locked on the empty ledger once more. He said, "I think maybe it never happened, or maybe it's still happening." And in that single shivering confession, the past reached forward, dark and unrelenting, into the present. The Blue Ridge foothills held their breath that morning, fog clinging to the trees like cobwebs, softening the world into shadowed gray. It was there, deep in a forgotten hollow, the deputies stumbled upon the Pinetop church, shuttered, sagging, and swallowed almost entirely by ivy and pine. Its windows were dark, the wood warped and blackened by decades of neglect. Yet to Harlow Cantrell, it was not just a building, it was everything he had ever known. This is home," he whispered at first, voice barely carrying over the crunch of leaves beneath his bare feet. He ran his fingers over the rotted door frame, tracing the grooves as if reading Braille. Home, until it wasn't. Moments later, the words came differently, edged with fear. No, it's a prison built by our dead." His eyes darted toward the windows, and then the cellar stairs, as if something invisible were waiting to correct him. Inside, the air was thick with dust and rot, the faint metallic scent of iron or blood lingering stubbornly. Child-sized pews lined the main hall, their surfaces scratched with letters and symbols that had long ceased to hold meaning for anyone outside the family. In one corner, twin beds were arranged in tight circles, sheets yellowed, mattresses collapsed. Harlow's hands trembled as he touched them. "We slept like this, like sheep. They said it would keep the first blood pure," he said, voice cracking, then paused, staring at the ceiling as if recalling a memory he did not want to own. Or maybe it was just to control us. The walls were carved with strange looping symbols, spirals, intersecting lines, and markings that Harlow swore were instructions, warnings, or prayers. These, he whispered, tracing a jagged triangle. This is the covenant, the first blood. They made us swear it. Yet he shivered and shook his head, muttering, "No, no, we weren't made. We chose. Or maybe they chose us." His contradictions rolled over the deputies like a storm, unsettling the air, twisting certainty into fog. The church groaned under its own weight, every floorboard, every rotten beam echoing like a living thing. Harlow's voice faltered, torn between nostalgia and terror. "I loved it. Then I hated it. I still hear them there, laughing or crying. I can't tell." Outside, the wind stirred the branches like skeletal fingers, and in that abandoned sanctuary, the lines between memory and madness blurred. The Pinetop Church was no longer just a building in the Blue Ridge. It was a living testament to isolation, obsession, and a bloodline that refused to let the past go. And Harlow, the last Cantrell, was both witness and prisoner, caught in a legacy of shadow that would not release him. Harlow Cantrell's voice trembled in the dim light of the deputy's cruiser, as though the words themselves were too heavy to carry. "It's called the covenant, the first blood," he whispered, his fingers twisting the edge of his torn jacket. "Only Cantrells could be with Cantrells. That was the rule, always." He stared out the window at the shivering pines, his eyes reflecting a forest of memories, some real, some fractured. But then his mouth moved again, contradicting itself almost instantly. "No, wait. There were no marriages, only assignments," he said, voice dropping to a haunted rasp. "We were given our roles, told who to bear children with, told who to trust and who never to speak to." He swallowed hard, as if the act of remembering could choke him. His lips quivered, revealing the strain of generations pressing down on a single 19-year-old frame. The deputies listened, uneasily scribbling notes, but Harlow's words seemed to curl around them like smoke, impossible to grasp fully. He pressed his palms against the cold glass of the cruiser, as though touching the night outside could anchor him to something real. "We were taught the bloodline must never mix with outsiders, not because it's right, not because it's safe, because the first blood, it's sacred or cursed. We didn't know which. Sometimes both." He rocked back slightly, eyelids fluttering as if he were recalling a litany of whispered instructions, shouted orders, and warnings older than the county itself. He was taught to feel fear and love at the same time. Fear for ourselves, love for what? The blood? The family? God? I can't remember. Harlow's contradictions tore through the silence of the cruiser like a storm breaking against fragile glass. He pressed his palms against the cold glass of the cruiser, as though touching the night outside could anchor him to something real. They told me I had to obey it, he whispered, voice shaken so violently it became a low, guttural echo. Obey the covenant, or the blood would devour us all. And maybe it already did. Outside, the Appalachian night pressed close, the wind rattling the skeletal branches of the pines. Inside, the young survivor trembled, a human conduit of 5 generations of isolation, inbreeding, and ritual. His memories warped with each sentence, a living testament to the psychological decay that had consumed the Pinetop line. And through it all, the covenant, both sacred and cursed, lingered like a shadow, binding Harlow, the last Cantrell, to a destiny he could barely understand, let alone escape. The cellar beneath the Pinetop church smelled of damp wood, mold, and something far older, something that belonged to no one alive. Deputies hesitated at the steps, but Harlow Cantrell moved forward as if the shadows themselves were guiding him. There, tucked into a corner behind broken crates and rotten hymnals, lay the family charts. Faded ink traced the tangled branches of the Cantrell Pinetop lineage, 5 generations looping over themselves, names repeating in dizzying, impossible patterns. Harlow knelt beside them, fingers hovering, trembling. These are us, he said softly. His voice cracked, the words fragile as cobwebs. No, wait, not us, not all of us. Some of them weren't real. He leaned closer, whispering over her name. This is my great-uncle Samuel. No, that's my father. Or maybe me. Each attempt to identify an ancestor contradicted the last, each declaration erasing the previous truth like ink washed from a page by rain. He pointed at the branching names, his gaze flicking between generations. I was the 7th son of a 7th son, he murmured, as if saying it out loud might summon some hidden power. Then he froze, staring at the chart as though it had betrayed him. No, I never had brothers, he whispered, the sound nearly lost beneath the cellar's creaking floorboards. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on the deputies, reminding them that this was more than a genealogy. It was a map of isolation, obsession, and repetition so extreme it had fractured a mind before it even reached the last living Cantrell. Harlow's eyes darted across the charts, tracing names that seemed to loop back onto themselves, creating a dizzying labyrinth of blood and obligation. We repeated ourselves, he said almost to the shadows, almost as if the walls might answer. Every name, every face, recycled, like we were trying to remember something God had forgotten, or maybe trying to hide something from him. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, but Harlow's voice grew quieter, closer to a tremor than a word. I don't know who I am anymore. They made us all into one. Or maybe I was always one. I can't tell the difference. His hand shook violently, tapping on a name again and again, as if by repetition he could anchor himself to reality. In the flickering lamplight, the chart seemed to writhe. Each looped line, each repeated name whispered of generations trapped in a closed circle, carrying secrets and sins too heavy for memory. And in that cellar, Harlow, the last Pinetop heir, was both witness and prisoner, a living testament to a lineage that had folded in on itself, leaving him to carry the weight of its inescapable repeating curse. The cellar air was thick, suffocating, carrying the faint metallic tang of something long buried. Deputies shone their flashlights across the cracked stone floor, and there, beneath the old baptismal font, they found 'em. Small bones, brittle and yellowed, scattered as if left behind by hands too hurried or too careful to arrange. The shadows seemed to twitch and pulse around the remains, whispering secrets only Harlow Cantrell could or would understand. They died of winter sickness, Harlow muttered first, voice tight, trembling as he avoided the deputy's gaze. His eyes were hollow, darting, as though the dead themselves were accusing him, as though the dead could remember him. Cold, hunger, the fever, it took him. But as he spoke, his words faltered, twisted against the darkness. No, they weren't gone. They were returned. He knelt beside the bones, trembling violently, fingers hovering just above the brittle shapes. Every time a child was born with the mark, he whispered, voice low, almost a chant. We sent 'em back to where they belong, to the covenant, to the first blood. He shuddered, and the deputies flinched at the guttural sound of memory, or something darker, rising from deep within him. Harlow's narrative fractured further with every passing moment. I don't know if I did it, or if they did it to me, or maybe it was always meant to happen. I can't remember, he stammered, voice cracking. His hand shook as if the weight of generations pressed upon his fragile frame, a burden of blood, ritual, and secrecy passed down like a disease. The bones beneath the font were arranged in a silent, grotesque echo of the life that had once filled the church above. Harlow's eyes welled, his lips moving in fragments of forgotten prayers, confessions, and commands he could not name. We were never allowed to leave, to mix, to touch outsiders, and so the children, they had to... His voice dissolved into a whisper, almost lost to the chill of the cellar. The deputies looked away, but Harlow could not. He traced the faint, cracked lines of the bones with shaking fingers. I hear them still, he admitted, voice low, haunted, calling me, punishing me, reminding me, and I can't tell if I'm crying for them or for myself. In that cellar, where the Pinetop lineage had been both protected and corrupted, Harlow, the last Cantrell, stood trembling, a living vessel of a family that had never let life or death move freely. And as the shadows closed in, the evidence of the closed-loop children whispered the truth no ledger could hold. Some bloodlines are never meant to survive, and some curses are never meant to end. The cellar smelled of rot, dust, and time itself, a heavy, choking mixture that seemed to cling to the bones and walls alike. Harlow Cantrell knelt among broken crates and shattered pews, hands trembling as deputies lifted a small cardboard box from the far corner. Inside were cassette tapes, yellowed, brittle, their labels scrawled in fading ink, dates ranging from the 1970s to the 1990s. Each tape was a fragment of memory preserved in magnetic decay, a voice reaching from the past to the present and perhaps beyond. They were always recording, Harlow whispered, his voice uneven, ragged, trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. He traced the labels with his fingertips. Every sermon, every hymn, every confession, everything we did, it was on here. They wanted it remembered, or maybe they wanted it erased. The deputies set up a small portable player, the tape whirring to life with a hiss and a crackle. Voices emerged from the static, low, reverent, chanting hymns that seemed to bend around the walls of the cellar. Then a confession, a voice unmistakable, young and trembling, uttering words of guilt, obedience, and fear. And yet it was Harlow's voice, decades before he was born. That's Father's father, he stammered, eyes wide, voice shaken so violently it became a whisper caught between fear and revelation. No, that was also me, or maybe I always was. I don't understand. How can it be me before I existed? He sank to the floor, trembling, hands clutching the edges of the tape box as though it were both talisman and tormentor. The recordings continued, hymns recited in unison, whispers of rituals, lists of names, confessions that made the air heavy, almost solid. Every voice seemed to merge into Harlow's, yet each fragment contradicted the last, the same way he contradicted himself. His mind fractured further with every playback. I hear them, all of them, singing, confessing, punishing me, guiding me. I can't tell which is memory and which is curse. Outside, the Appalachian night pressed against the walls of the cellar, branches scratching at the windows like fingernails. Inside, Harlow rocked back and forth, murmuring fragments of sermons and chants, some of which he claimed to remember, some that seemed to spill from his lips unbidden. I am them, and they are me. We are the same, and yet I am still here, he whispered, his voice breaking as the tape hissed and warbled in the silence. In that cellar, the Cantrell Pinetop Bloodline spoke across generations through brittle plastic and fading magnetic tape, whispering a single terrifying truth. The line between life and legacy, voice and spirit, past and present, had dissolved, and Harlow, the last surviving heir, was both audience and actor in a story that had been recording itself long before he drew his first breath. The cellar seemed to close in around Harlow Cantrell, the shadows of the Blue Ridge night seeping through the cracked wooden floorboards like spilled ink. Deputies followed him down the narrow stairs, flashlights cutting swaths of pale light across walls etched with strange, jagged symbols. At first, Harlow's gaze flitted nervously from one mark to another, lips moving silently as if he were tracing them with memory alone. I don't remember, he whispered, trembling, voice almost swallowed by the damp darkness. I can't. Yet then, with sudden, eerie precision, he began to recite a chant, low, melodic, fragmented, yet perfectly ordered. The words tumbled from his lips as if a hidden voice inside him had claimed the memory decades before he was born. Each phrase echoed the carved patterns on the walls, spirals, triangles, intersecting lines that the deputies could only describe as both religious and grotesque. I don't understand," Harlow stammered, hands clutching his head, sweat beading on his brow. They did this to me, or I don't know," he whispered, cracking. I channel them. I speak what they spoke. I feel what they felt. I am. His eyes rolled back briefly, body trembling, caught between lucidity and the pull of generations he could neither escape nor fully remember. He continued, phrases overlapping, muttering one moment, reciting word for word the next. Past and present coiled around each other like smoke, as if the ritual itself had imprinted itself upon his flesh and mind. Each syllable was both command and confession, a repetition of worship, obedience, and the twisted devotion that had preserved the Cantrell Pinetop bloodline for over a century. By the time the chanting subsided, Harlow collapsed against the wall, gasping. The deputies were left with the hollow silence of the cellar and a terrifying truth. The ritual was not just memory, it was inheritance, etched into flesh, bone, and mind. And the last Cantrell, shivering, scarred, haunted, was both priest and sacrifice of a lineage that refused to die. The knife pressed against Harlow Cantrell like a living thing, the Appalachian wind clawing at the cruiser's windows as deputies tried to piece together the story of his escape. He spoke, then stopped, then spoke again, each version contradicting the last, fracturing the narrative like a shattered mirror. "I ran," he whispered at first, voice hoarse, eyes fixed on some distant, unseen horizon. "Through the woods, through the hollow. They couldn't catch me." Then, moments later, his head dropped, and he murmured, No, they freed me. Someone or something opened the door. I didn't have to run." His hands clenched the seat, fingers pale and trembling, nails digging into leather as though grounding himself to the reality he could no longer trust. "I was chosen," he said next, voice rising, a strange cadence like that of a boy repeating a lesson learned long ago. I was meant to leave, to carry it, to bring it somewhere else. They picked me. I didn't choose. I never chose." His eyes darted frantically, as if he were trying to locate the invisible figures of his ancestors pressing him forward. And then, finally, his voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "Or maybe I woke up already outside, already free, already damned." He rocked back in the seat, forehead pressed to his knees, shivering as though the mere act of thinking about the escape tore at him physically. The deputies sat in silence, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. Each version of the story seemed equally possible, equally impossible. Every detail warped under the pressure of memory, hallucination, and guilt. Were these the recollections of a traumatized survivor, or the confessions of someone still entwined with the curse that had plagued his family for over a century. Harlow's eyes flicked up suddenly, haunted and accusatory, as if seeing the shadows of his family in the rearview mirror. I don't know who I am, where it ended, or if it ever ended," he whispered. His voice broke, a mixture of despair and fear, exposing a mind teetering on the brink of collapse. Did I escape, or did I carry it out? Outside, the Appalachian woods seemed to lean closer, branches scratching against the cruiser like fingernails on glass. The line between past and present, survivor and heir, guilt and destiny had dissolved completely. Harlow Cantrell, the last of the Pinetop line, was both free and bound, both witness and inheritor, lost in the labyrinth of memory, shadow, and inherited darkness. The lab was cold, sterile, and brightly lit, a world away from the misted hollows of Pinetop, yet heavy with a weight that felt almost spiritual. Harlow Cantrell sat slumped in the corner, hands covering his face, as the deputies and forensic specialists reviewed the DNA results. At first, the numbers seemed impossible, absurd. Generational looping so extreme that mathematically Harlow's entire lineage resembled a single repeating family unit. The Cantrell Pinetop bloodline had folded in on itself over and over for more than a century. Harlow lifted his face, eyes wild and haunted, pupils dilated as if the truth had burned into his soul. "I didn't survive them," he whispered, voice trembling so violently it cracked. I am them." He rocked back and forth on the metal chair, the weight of 5 generations pressing down, ancestral voices echoing in his mind. All the rules, the rituals, the children, the covenant, it wasn't meant to end. I wasn't meant to escape. I carry it. I am it. The deputies watched in stunned silence. Every contradiction, every fractured memory, every splintered recollection now made a cruel sort of sense. Harlow's life, his mind, his very identity had been shaped by a cycle too ancient and insidious for ordinary comprehension. He was not just the last Cantrell. He was the living embodiment of a bloodline that refused to die, the final vessel of a curse that had threaded itself through the bones, rituals, and confessions of generations. Harlow's voice dropped to a trembling whisper, as if confiding in ghosts. "I don't know where I end and where they begin. Every word I speak, every memory I have, it's them and it's me. I can't tell the difference. Maybe it's always been this way. Maybe it always will be." Outside, the Appalachian wind rattled against the windows like skeletal fingers, carrying with it the cold, eternal weight of the hollow. The shadows of Pinetop seemed to stretch across the distance, across time itself, as though the mountains themselves remembered what science had revealed. The documentary ends there, unresolved, leaving the audience suspended in dread. Did Harlow escape the Pinetop curse, or was he never meant to escape at all? Was he a survivor, or the final incarnation of a bloodline that refused to die? In the silence that follows, the answer is left to the imagination, and the truth, like the shadows in Pinetop Hollow, lingers, inescapable, eternal, and quietly consuming.